Charlotte Hayes is a 28-year-old financial analyst from London with a job that demands precision and logic down to the last decimal point. She has a devoted boyfriend, a compact flat in Islington, and a life built on unshakable practicality. Like many successful young professionals, Charlotte doesn't believe in ghosts. To her, fear is merely a software glitch of the mind. In September, Charlotte decided to take a solo vacation to finish the final draft of a nonfiction book on economic trends. She rented a small house in rural Devonshire, an isolated and quiet place far from the city's rush. The house had a peculiar name, the Rookery. The house was a typical piece of English countryside architecture, built of gray stone, with a steep roof and small diamond-shaped windows. It was at least 200 years old. To Charlotte, this was merely history and quaint charm. Her first impression was one of calm, serenity, and comfort, a perfect place for focus. However, from the very first afternoon, the setting began to paint its own atmosphere. The house had a distinct smell, dampness, old coal, and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of withered lavender. The oak floorboards creaked under every step, as if the house were sighing. Charlotte felt a constant draft whispering through the hallway, though every window was tightly shut. The isolation was almost complete. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields and dense trees. The phone signal was weak, barely enough to send the occasional text. It was the silence Charlotte had longed for, but it also amplified her sense of vulnerability. The first day passed in quietness, with Charlotte working in the living room, facing an old brick-lined fireplace. She felt safe and confident, accompanied by her coffee and laptop. That night, the uncanny began. Charlotte woke at around 3 a.m., not because of a sound, but because of the feeling that someone was watching her. She lay still in the dark, listening to her heartbeat. She reassured herself it was only the change of environment. Then she heard a faint noise, like the rustle of fabric. The sound came from the corner of the room, near the old wardrobe. She turned on the bedside lamp. The weak yellow light filled the room. The wardrobe was closed. Nothing there. She got up and checked. The wardrobe was completely empty, except for her spare pajamas. She closed the door and went back to bed. But as she lay down, she noticed something strange. The wardrobe door wasn't fully shut. It was open just a sliver, about half an inch. Charlotte was sure she had closed it. She was a perfectionist. She got up again, this time with slight irritation. She slammed the door shut, probably just a loose latch, she told herself. Logic explained it all. Old house, weak lock, draft. The second incident happened the next morning. Charlotte left her favorite pencil, a red carpenter's pencil, on her desk. When she returned 10 minutes later with her tea, the pencil was gone. She searched the desk, the floor, between books. Nothing. She frowned. Did I move it? She thought. She blamed her own forgetfulness. But what truly planted the seed of doubt happened on the second evening. Charlotte was sitting on the sofa reading when she caught something at the corner of her eye. She turned her head so quickly it hurt her neck. A shadow, a small black shadow, seemed to glide across the hallway and vanish behind the corner. The shadow wasn't hers, nor that of any object. She stood up, her heartbeat quickening. She walked into the hallway. It was empty. She stopped and stared at the corner. The light from the living room illuminated it. Nothing there. A visual glitch. I'm tired, she reasoned. But the familiar had started to feel distorted, unnatural, the uncanny valley. That night, she couldn't sleep. She heard the wooden floorboards creak repeatedly. Not a single random creak, but a steady rhythm, as if someone were walking slowly, right above her. Charlotte knew her bedroom was on the top floor. Above her was only the roof. The sense of being watched grew so strong, she pulled the blanket over her face. She felt a chill surround her body, inexplicable, even though the heating was on. She lay there in the dark, and the creaking stopped directly above her ceiling. Then came a faint whisper, like wind slipping through a tiny crack. But it wasn't wind. It had the tone of a human voice, strangled and low. Charlotte shuddered, knowing the early signs were over. She had stepped into a realm her logic could no longer reach. The faint whisper from the ceiling had officially transformed Charlotte Hayes' discomfort into true fear. She jumped out of bed, switched on every light in the room. yanked open the curtains, and stared into the empty night. Though her rational mind still searched for explanations, birds, expanding materials, the intensity and nature of the phenomena had changed. The deep carving of fear began with an assault on her workspace. The next day, Charlotte decided to avoid the bedroom. She brought her laptop and notes down to the living room, trying to work near the fireplace where she felt warmer. But the haunting presence had followed her down. She was typing, analyzing financial data, when she heard a new sound. This time, it wasn't creaking or rustling. It was a faint, muffled sob coming from inside the wall right next to the fireplace. The sound was close, so close it felt as if someone were trapped within the narrow space behind the stones. Charlotte held her breath. The crying lasted about 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. She touched the stone wall. It was freezing cold and solid. She pressed her ear against it, but all she could hear was deep silence. She stared at the old bricks surrounding the fireplace. They looked darker, damp somehow. Then came the first visual attack. Sitting opposite the fireplace, Charlotte noticed something physical. On one of the tiles in front of it, a small wet spot had appeared. At first, she thought she had spilled tea, but on closer inspection, the moisture wasn't water. It was dark brown, almost black, and slowly seeping from the grout line between two tiles. It looked like diluted old blood. Charlotte jumped back. She grabbed a tissue and wiped it. The smell was metallic and sour, but it dried quickly. When the spot disappeared, she noticed a small new crack in the grout beneath the tile. Immediately after, the tension spiked. Every light in the living room began flickering violently. The flashing glow cast shifting, dancing shadows, and for a split second, Charlotte saw a tall black silhouette standing in the doorway. When the light steadied, the figure was gone. Charlotte was now in full panic. She wanted to call her boyfriend, Thomas, but as if the house had anticipated that, her phone signal vanished completely. She lifted the phone. No service. The anonymous threat had begun to hunt her through psychological isolation. Charlotte had to drive into the nearest town just to make a call. She told Thomas everything, trying to sound calm, but unable to mask the terror in her voice, the creaks above her, the crying in the walls, and the bleeding grout that smelled of iron. Thomas, a fund manager and a deeply rational man, sounded confused and skeptical. Charlotte, you've been overworked. It's a 200-year-old house. Listen to me. It's just material contraction. A smell, old dampness. You're alone in total silence. Your mind is amplifying things. You don't understand, Charlotte shouted, tears in her eyes. There's a black stain leaking from the wall. It's not my imagination. Rust, darling. Iron in the old mortar. Probably high humidity. You're stressed. Breathe. I'll drive down tomorrow night and we'll check everything together. The call ended, and Charlotte felt more alone than ever. Thomas's doubt didn't ease her fear. It deepened her sense of being seen as delusional. She began to wonder, am I going insane? The woman who prided herself on her mental stability was now questioning her own sanity. She returned to the house, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. She forced herself to search for the house's history. Using the weak Wi-Fi, thankfully still working, Charlotte began to dig. She typed, "The Rookery, Devonshire, murder." She found an old faded article from 1958. It wasn't a murder case, but a story about the mysterious disappearance of a young couple, Evelyn and George Thorne, who had purchased the house in the early 1950s. Police concluded they had run away, possibly due to debt, because the house had been left with all their belongings, including a suitcase full of clothes. Charlotte looked around the living room. There was an oak grandfather clock in the corner. It had stopped. She walked closer and saw that the hands were frozen at 3. She remembered she had woken up at 3 a.m. The creaking had started around that time. The threat wasn't just a shadow or a cry. It had an identity. Evelyn and George Thorne. Charlotte felt a chill race down her spine. They hadn't run away. They had never left the house. The escalation peaked on the third night. Charlotte tried to sleep on the living room sofa, far from the dreadful bedroom. She lay under the dim light of a table lamp. At exactly 3 a.m., the grandfather clock suddenly began to tick. Clack! 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 Even though it had long been dead. Then, from the fireplace wall, the one that had bled, a clear voice echoed. Not a cry or a whisper. A woman's voice, desperate and trembling. Open quote, He put me in the wall, Charlotte. He put me in the wall. At that same moment, something moved on the hardwood floor. Charlotte looked down and saw her red carpenter's pencil, the one that had vanished days ago, now lying at her feet. And right beside it, a deep, sharp scratch, about 6 inches long, gouged into the wooden floorboards. That mark could not have appeared naturally. It was undeniable, physical proof. Charlotte screamed, a raw, terrified scream. As her rational mind shattered, the house wasn't just listening, it was speaking. Close quote. Charlotte Hayes' scream of terror dissolved into the sudden silence of the house. She stared at the deep scratch in the wooden floor and the red carpenter's pencil, undeniable physical proof that she was surrounded by a horrific truth. The desperate accusation from within the wall, "He put me in the wall," had illuminated part of the mystery. Evelyn Thorne hadn't run away. She had been murdered by her husband, George, and entombed within the structure of the house. The sheer magnitude of horror paralyzed Charlotte. The thought of escape didn't even cross her mind. She was frozen, consumed by despair. And then the climax began. Every light in the living room went out. Darkness swallowed her whole, leaving only the faint glow of her laptop screen. The cold became unbearable, as if a slab of ice had been placed beside her. Evelyn's sobbing returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was above her, as though the spirit had broken free and now hovered in the air. Open quote, "He'll do it again. He knows I spoke. He's here." Close quote. Then came a second voice, a low, hoarse, chillingly angry voice, emanating from the black void at the staircase. It was a man's voice. Open quote, "She shouldn't have told, Charlotte. You shouldn't have listened." Close quote. Charlotte realized the horrifying truth. George Thorne, the murderer, was trapped too, and he knew she had uncovered his secret. She hadn't only freed Evelyn, she had freed the killer and his hatred. She tried to move, but her legs refused. She was pinned between two vengeful spirits in the dark. The sensation of touch became unmistakable. A cold, heavy hand pressed down on her shoulder, forcing her back into the chair. Open quote, "Don't touch me," Charlotte hissed, desperate. Close quote. George Thorne's voice came again, this time right beside her ear. It wasn't a whisper. It was a venomous hiss. Open quote, "This house remembers what I did, and now it will remember you too." Close quote. At that same instant, Evelyn's voice rose into a frantic cry, trying to warn her. Open quote, "Run! Run before he finishes it." Close quote. In that split second of sheer panic, Charlotte's eyes fixed on the dim light of her laptop screen. Her red carpenter's pencil lay nearby. She grabbed it, and with the strength of pure desperation, hurled it toward the staircase, toward where George's voice had come from. No sound, no impact. The pencil had passed through him. But that act bought Charlotte a precious moment to break free. She leapt up and ran for the front door. As she sprinted, a violent crash thundered from the fireplace, the place where Evelyn's spirit had been confined. The wall seemed to shudder, as if George, enraged by the distraction, was attacking. Charlotte fumbled with the lock, flung the door open, and burst into the freezing night of Devonshire. She didn't look back. The haunting resolution began when she reached her car, parked a short distance from the house. She jumped in, locked the doors, and tried to start the engine. It whined but wouldn't turn over. Again and again, nothing. Through the windshield, in the weak beam of her headlights, she saw him. George Thorne's silhouette stood in the doorway of the house, tall, black, and utterly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Open quote, "You can't leave the memory, Charlotte," George's voice whispered, now carried like wind through the car's glass. "It's part of the house now." Close quote. In her desperation, Charlotte finally remembered a trick to start the car differently. The engine roared to life, and she hit the gas, tearing down the dark country road. She drove through the night without stopping until she reached a brightly lit, crowded service station on the outskirts of London. Days later, she told the entire story to the police. The Devonshire authorities, skeptics of anything supernatural, were nonetheless compelled by her panic and by her detailed account of the 1958 disappearance. They investigated. They found the deep scratch in the wooden floor exactly where Charlotte had described it. More importantly, they discovered a hollow space behind the old bricks of the fireplace wall. There were no remains, nothing but dirt and a rotted scrap of fabric. Police concluded it was an old house, and Charlotte had suffered a breakdown. But Charlotte knew the truth. They hadn't found anything because George hadn't buried Evelyn. He had sealed her in the wall, and her spirit, once freed, had escaped. Charlotte returned to London. She quit her job, cut off contact with Thomas, who still believed she was having a nervous collapse, and lived in quiet ruin. Each night, she heard the faint creaking of wooden floors, even in her modern flat. She carried the house's cold within her. The Loop and the Final Whisper. 6 months later, the Rookery went up for sale again. Charlotte saw the listing by chance on a real estate website. A young family was soon to move in, drawn by the home's rustic charm. That night, curled up on her sofa, Charlotte closed her eyes, and then she heard it, a final whisper. Not Evelyn's voice, not George's, a child's voice. Open quote, "She told them, Mummy. She told them, and now he's angry again." Close quote. Charlotte opened her eyes. She hadn't ended it. She had only reset the cycle of violence. She had carried the curse forward, and the house was ready to listen to new screams. Charlotte had survived, but she was ruined forever. 6 months after escaping the Rookery, Charlotte Hayes was no longer the same person. She lived in a modern apartment built of steel and glass in London, an environment she hoped would be sterile to the supernatural. But no protection mattered. She was permanently haunted. Every night, she heard the creak of wooden floors, the rasp of mortar, and the whisper of the wind, sounds that existed only in her mind, echoes of the listening house. The psychological aftermath had turned her into a shadow. She quit her job, unable to focus on complex financial logic. She lived in a constant state of tension and vigilance. Any silence was a threat because she feared that a gasp or a sob might slip through. But the worst part was the guilt she could not shake. The child's whisper. "She told them, Mummy. She told them. And now he's angry again." Forced her to face the truth. She was not a hero. She had disturbed a resting place, unleashed a murderer, and let a new family step into the cycle of horror. One April morning, Charlotte was watching a local Devonshire news channel, a new habit of hers, when she saw a brief headline flash by. Family who recently moved into the Rookery abruptly leaves after 3 weeks. No details were given, but it was the signal she had feared. George Thorne had begun again. Her life was now tied to the cycle, and she knew she had to return, not to save others, but to free herself from this eternal haunting. Charlotte began a thorough investigation of the Thorne family. She hired an unsuspecting historian to search for records of George Thorne after 1958, assuming he had fled. She found a small but crucial detail. George was an unlicensed carpenter and builder, known for using old-fashioned and cheap construction methods. That explained the red carpenter's pencil she had found. Charlotte began to believe the key was not Evelyn's remains, but George's, or something that bound him. If George was the murderer, he wouldn't be trapped the way Evelyn was, unless he'd been imprisoned by the house itself, or killed by someone else. She drove back to Devonshire. This time, she didn't rent the house. She parked a few hundred meters away in the bushes and watched. The Rookery looked normal, quiet, but lifeless. That night, under dim moonlight, Charlotte slipped inside. She carried a small shovel and a sledgehammer, both hidden in her car trunk. Inside, the house was cold and dark, and the presence of George Thorne hung thick in the air. The chill didn't come from outside. It was a cold born of hatred. Charlotte went straight to the living room, to the fireplace. The deep scratches on the wooden floor were still there, a sharp reminder. She pressed her ear to the fireplace wall. Instead of crying, she heard a long hiss, like a snake. She's back. The little listener is back to finish her work. Charlotte ignored it. She knew what she had to do. She believed Evelyn had led her to her own resting place. But she needed George to reveal his. Based on George's carpenter background, Charlotte focused on the foundation beneath the fireplace. She remembered that fireplaces often had a sealed ash chamber below the hearth. She used the shovel to pry up a rusted floor tile. It cracked. Beneath it was a layer of new, clumsily patched mortar. As she started smashing the mortar with the sledgehammer, the haunting surged to a new peak. Every door in the house began slamming violently, as if a storm was raging inside. China plates shattered across the kitchen shelves. George Thorne's voice roared right next to her ear. No longer a whisper, but a furious scream. "Stop! I won't go back to the darkness. You can't put me back." The darkness around Charlotte began to condense into a tall, solid black shape blocking the exit. It was George. This time she saw him clearly, a man in an old coat, face twisted with hatred. George lunged at her. Charlotte felt a horrifying physical shove to her back. She stumbled and fell, the sledgehammer slipping from her grasp. In desperation, she spotted the red carpenter's pencil lying nearby, the same one she had thrown before. A thought flashed through her mind. The pencil was George's, a symbol of his trade, his guilt, his curse. She crawled forward, grabbed the pencil, shut her eyes, and drove it hard into the floor, right into the deep scratch Evelyn had made. Immediately, a long, terrible groan reverberated through the house. But it wasn't George's voice. It was the house itself. The noise stopped. The physical weight lifted. George was gone. Charlotte stood up, exhausted, but surrounded by an eerie calm. She turned back to the fireplace and continued her work. She broke through the mortar, and beneath it, inside a small cavity, she found remains. Not George's, but a child's. Alongside the bones was a small locket. When Charlotte touched it, she saw an image. Evelyn, holding a baby. Evelyn wasn't just George's wife. She was the mother of that child. Charlotte realized the truth. George had killed them both. And the sobbing she had always heard was Evelyn's grief, forced to listen to her child entombed beside her. Charlotte hadn't freed George. She had enraged him. She had trapped him with his own pencil, but she had uncovered the second spirit. The child's remains, and the locket, were taken out of the house. The next day, the police discovered the child's bones. The missing persons case became a double homicide. Charlotte returned to London. She was broken, but the loop was shattered. She had freed the house from George's curse, but her life had been recorded. One night, while watching TV, she saw another news report. Police had made a new discovery at the Rookery, the remains of George Thorne, buried within a newly cemented foundation. A perfect trap he had built to hide Evelyn, which became his own tomb. Perhaps Evelyn had finally taken her revenge. Charlotte smiled painfully. She had won, but when she turned off the TV, she heard a faint hiss, not from the walls, but from inside the TV itself. He's free now, Charlotte, but the house is still listening. She knew then. Old walls, even concrete ones, remember every scream they've ever heard. She would never escape them. 2 years had passed since Charlotte Hayes fled the Rookery. The house had become a pariah. No one dared to stay longer than a month, until it was purchased by a real estate organization. They hired a caretaker, Simon Clarke, a hardened 55-year-old veteran who believed that true horrors had flesh and bone. Simon moved into the Rookery in the cold of November. The house was silent, an unnatural silence, devoid of birds or even the whisper of wind. It unsettled him more than any noise could. He discovered a box filled with architectural blueprints and handwritten notes with phrases like ash chamber and wooden beams, the paranoid remnants of the former tenant, Charlotte. The strangeness began not with whispers, but with knocking. Every night, exactly at 10 p.m., 3 gentle, polite knocks sounded at the front door. Simon always checked, but no one was ever there. After several nights, he decided to ignore it. But the moment the knocking started again, a powerful wave of cold air swept through the hallway. Annoyed, Simon opened the door, and this time he heard a faint groan coming from beneath the oak threshold. Kneeling, he pried up a cracked fragment of wood and pulled out a small piece of a red carpenter's pencil. The instant he touched it, a cold fury overtook him. George Thorne had returned, bound by the destruction Charlotte had set in motion. George's voice growled from the fireplace wall. "I am the master of this house, and you are here because of her." Charlotte's echo. Simon, ever the practical man, responded with a kitchen knife. But George attacked not through force, but through the mind. The refrigerator door burst open, furniture toppled, dishes shattered. He wanted to torment Simon the same way he had tormented Charlotte. Simon realized he couldn't fight with strength. He turned to Charlotte's old blueprints and her obsession with the fireplace. He believed the key lay in George's greed. He rushed to the fireplace wall and began chipping at the mortar. The dark force of George tried to shove him into the cold flames within the hearth. Simon pushed back and plunged the knife into the wall. "You're no master. You're just ashes." He broke through the plaster and uncovered something Charlotte had missed. An old, handwritten will, signed by Evelyn Thorne, leaving her entire estate to a friend in London if she were to die. George hadn't feared being exposed as a murderer. He had feared losing ownership, losing the house. Simon had freed the Rookery from George's greed. The spirit let out one final agonized roar, and the coldness vanished. Simon left the Rookery soon after. The house was finally silent. He carried the will with him and a new mission: to find Charlotte Hayes. He was no longer the skeptic he once was. He had been bound to a truth so horrifying that only she could understand. Eventually, Simon found Charlotte's address in London. He stood before the sleek, modern apartment door. He knocked. Charlotte opened it, staring at the weary but steady man who carried with him the cold of Devonshire. Simon looked at her and said, "Miss Hayes, I'm the new caretaker. I think you forgot this." He handed her the old will. Charlotte took it without asking about ghosts. She simply looked into his eyes. "What did you hear?" she asked. Simon gave a pained smile. His gaze now carried the same dreadful understanding that only the two of them could share. No more sounds. "But I saw something." He pointed towards Charlotte's turned-off TV. "The house that listens is gone, but every wall remembers the screams it heard in your city too, Miss Hayes." Simon Clarke had been freed from the Rookery, but he carried Charlotte's sensitivity with him. And now, the two survivors were bound by a terrible understanding: that the listening had followed them to London, waiting for the next scream. The meeting between Charlotte Hayes and Simon Clarke was not a release. It was a confirmation of a curse. They were two survivors, bound by the dreadful understanding that the listening had followed them to London. Both bore psychological scars that could never heal, and they decided to live together in Charlotte's apartment, not out of love, but out of necessity. They believed that the combined strength of two minds would be stronger than one in this ongoing battle. The threat Simon had sensed, every wall remembers the screams it once heard, became horrifically clear. The terror was no longer confined to rotting oak and crumbling plaster. In London, it was integrated into the modern infrastructure. The creaking of old wooden floors was replaced by the groaning of steel frames and the deep, pulsing moan of expanding concrete, rhythmic, like a collective, ragged breath emanating from within the plaster and mesh walls. Simon and Charlotte began to hear indistinct whispers from phone speakers, from earbuds when no music played, and most disturbingly, from the building's ventilation system, voices blending into warped syllables, always stopping just before they could be understood. Even the elevator became a threat. Every time it stopped at their floor, it was accompanied by a sudden biting chill and a long mechanical groan, as if something heavy was being dragged. Charlotte, regaining her logic with Simon by her side, began researching the construction history of their neighborhood. She wasn't looking for personal murders. She searched for industrial tragedies, poverty, and collapses of the past. They discovered that their modern apartment complex was built on the site of a decayed Victorian slum, later replaced by a textile factory where many young workers had died in horrific accidents. The concrete walls, meant to insulate, were in fact infused with the collective memory of suffering. The escalation reached its peak one evening as they worked together. All electronic devices in the room turned on simultaneously. The TV screen displayed a face, not George Thorne or Evelyn, but that of a young, gaunt girl, eyes wide with terror, wearing a tattered bonnet. A distorted voice came through every device at once. She was crushed beneath the wheel. We all screamed, and no one listened. Now the city listens. Charlotte and Simon realized the threat was no longer personal. The city itself was a spectral entity, fed by the silence of the living and the forgetting of the dead. They had to act. After analyzing old maps, they located a sealed utility chamber beneath the building's basement, directly where the textile factory once stood. That night, they descended. As they entered, every light went out, and they were swallowed by darkness and the rising groan of machinery, as if the pipes themselves were tightening, accompanied by the collective scream of trapped souls echoing from every direction. Simon shone his flashlight deeper. He saw a massive, rusted iron wheel, and beneath it, a small, torn bonnet, identical to the one worn by the girl on the screen. Charlotte knelt, picked up the bonnet, and whispered, "We are listening. We have heard you." Instantly, the scream stopped. The cold receded. They had not freed the souls, but they had acknowledged them, soothing another buried tragedy. They left the basement. The threat had not vanished. it had merely changed. They knew they could never escape London. They had become the unwilling memory of the city. Though George Thorne was buried and Evelyn finally at rest, Charlotte and Simon were now bound to hear the mourning of thousands of forgotten souls. They no longer lived in fear, but in eternal vigilance, haunted by what awaited beneath the city's foundations. They had reclaimed their lives, but at a price. They could never stop being the listeners. Silence had been broken forever, and they knew that every wall has a story to tell.